"That is not a dog." Dr. Mark Harrison muttered the words before he could stop himself, his eyes locked on the small, trembling creature nestled in the battered cardboard box. The nurse standing beside him, a young woman named Ellie, sucked in a sharp breath. "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning over for a closer look. Mark didn't answer immediately. His pulse quickened as he reached inside, carefully lifting the tiny animal. Its fur was soft, but thicker than he expected, its snout slightly elongated, ears rounder than those of a normal puppy. But it was the eyes that gave him pause, large, golden, and unblinking, filled with something deeper than mere confusion. Something ancient. Something wild. The reception area of Harrison Veterinary Clinic was quiet this late in the evening, the usual hum of chatter absent. The person who had left the box had done so quickly, slipping out before anyone could question them. There was no note, no explanation, just a cardboard box, damp at the bottom, lined with an old towel, left at the clinic's doorstep, as if it contained nothing more than an unwanted pet. But this was no ordinary puppy. Ellie reached forward tentatively. "It looks like a husky mix? Maybe a Malamute?" Her voice was uncertain. "But there's something different about it." Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know yet, but we need to get it checked out. Let's move it to the back." Ellie nodded and gently carried the small creature to the examination table. It barely moved in her grasp, exhausted, its tiny body quivering with cold, and something else. Fear? Shock? Both? Mark quickly prepped his instruments. "Let's get a weight on it first." He placed it gently on the small digital scale. The screen flickered before settling at a mere 2 pounds. "Small for a husky mix," he murmured. He continued his examination, running his hands carefully along the tiny ribs, feeling the heartbeat beneath fragile bones. The little one let out a faint whimper, but did not struggle. As he examined its limbs, he noticed something odd about its paws. The pads were thicker than a normal pup's, the claws slightly sharper, even for a baby. "Something's off," he said, frowning. He looked up at Ellie. "Get me a DNA kit. I want to run a test." Ellie nodded and moved to the supply cabinet, retrieving the test kit swiftly. Mark swabbed the inside of the puppy's mouth with gentle precision before sealing the sample. The little creature stared up at him, its golden eyes unblinking. Mark sighed. "We'll know more when the test comes back, but I don't think this is a dog." Ellie swallowed. "Then what is it?" Before he could answer, the front door chime rang. A gust of cold air swept through the clinic as a man stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a thick jacket zipped up to his chin. His blue eyes scanned the room before landing on the box. "I need to know if someone dropped something off here tonight," he said, his voice firm. Mark exchanged a glance with Ellie. "Why do you ask?" The man hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because if they did, you might have something in your clinic that doesn't belong here. That's not a dog." The words hung in the air as if they carried a weight too heavy to simply dissipate. Dr. Mark Harrison watched the stranger carefully, trying to get a read on him. His tone was controlled, but there was an urgency that made Mark's pulse quicken. Ellie, who stood nearby, looked just as bewildered, her gaze darting between the man and the tiny creature on the exam table. Mark cleared his throat, trying to maintain his professionalism. "What do you mean, it doesn't belong here?" The man's piercing blue eyes remained fixed on the small, trembling animal. "You wouldn't understand," he said after a pause. "But I need to see it." Mark stepped protectively between the man and the table. "Sir, this is a veterinary clinic. I don't know who you are, and I'm not about to hand over an abandoned animal just because you say so." The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment Mark thought he might try to push past him. But instead, the stranger took a step back, running a hand through his thick hair. "Fine," he said, "but you don't know what you're dealing with. Just don't let it out of your sight." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out, leaving Mark and Ellie staring at the door as it slowly swung shut behind him. The soft chime of the door closing was the only sound in the quiet clinic. "What was that about?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "I have no idea." He turned back to the exam table, his eyes falling once again on the small creature lying there. The little one was trembling slightly, its eyes, golden and almost too intelligent, staring back at him. Mark felt a pang of something he couldn't quite describe. It wasn't pity, exactly, but rather a sense of responsibility. He couldn't just brush off the man's cryptic warning, but he also couldn't abandon this vulnerable creature. "We need to run some more tests," he said. "Ellie, get me the portable ultrasound. I want to see what's going on internally." Ellie nodded and fetched the device. Mark worked quickly but gently, moving the probe over the tiny animal's abdomen. He kept expecting to find something, anything, that would explain why it looked the way it did. But aside from being a little underweight, the internal scans looked normal. No unusual growths, no abnormalities in the organs. Just a small, shivering bundle of fur that defied easy categorization. Ellie leaned over, her brow furrowed. "Does it look different to you? I mean, compared to other puppies?" Mark nodded. "It does, but I can't put my finger on it yet." He turned off the ultrasound and gently placed the small creature back on the soft towel. It didn't resist, didn't struggle, just sat there, watching him with those uncanny eyes. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. This wasn't like anything he'd encountered before, and the lack of answers was starting to wear on him. The phone at the reception desk rang, breaking the silence. Ellie stepped out to answer it, leaving Mark alone with the little one. He reached down, gently stroking the soft fur along its back. The small body relaxed under his hand, and for a moment he felt a connection, a silent understanding that this tiny creature trusted him. When Ellie returned, she looked troubled. "That was the lab. They're saying they're swamped and can't prioritize our DNA sample. It might be a week before we get results." Mark frowned. "A week? That's a long time." Ellie hesitated. "Should we call them back? Try to push it through?" Mark shook his head. "No, we'll wait. But I want to keep it here overnight, just to monitor it. I don't feel comfortable sending it to a shelter until we know more." Ellie nodded. "I'll set up a kennel in the back." As the evening wore on, Mark found himself checking on the little one more often than necessary. Each time he walked into the back room, it would lift its head, those golden eyes meeting his as if it were trying to communicate something. The air in the clinic felt heavier than usual, as though the presence of this small creature had shifted something intangible. Ellie, too, seemed drawn to it. She stopped by the kennel every hour or so, speaking softly to the little one, offering it bits of food and water. The puppy, or whatever it was, seemed to respond to her kindness, eating tentatively and even wagging its tail ever so slightly when she approached. By the time the clinic closed, both Mark and Ellie were reluctant to leave. They took turns staying late, checking on the creature, making sure it was warm and comfortable. They didn't discuss it directly, but there was an unspoken understanding that this wasn't just an abandoned animal. It was something more. something that neither of them could fully articulate. When the clinic was finally locked up and the lights dimmed, Mark sat at his desk, staring at the charts and scans he had taken earlier. None of it made sense. The small creature's body was perfectly healthy, yet its appearance and those eyes suggested something far from ordinary. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. The image of the man who had walked into the clinic lingered in his mind. There had been something unsettling about him. His insistence, his cryptic warning. But what could it mean? And why had he shown up so soon after the creature had been dropped off? Mark ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion tugging at him. He didn't have answers, and the mystery was only growing deeper. For now, all he could do was keep the little one safe and wait for the DNA results to come in. Maybe then, they'd have some clarity. But as he closed his eyes, trying to push the questions aside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he was waiting for might lead to even more questions. The morning brought a thin light into the clinic, filtering through the blinds in Mark's office. He had stayed late the night before, poring over every book and online resource he could find. None of it pointed him closer to understanding what the little creature might be. Now, sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, he felt the same restless energy he'd carried all night. Something wasn't adding up, and it wasn't just the strange features of the animal. It was the man's words. "You might have something that doesn't belong here." What had he meant by that? What had he meant by... Ellie arrived a few minutes later, her hands full with a breakfast sandwich and a coffee of her own. "Morning," she greeted him, then paused. "You look like you didn't sleep." Mark offered a weak smile. "What gave it away?" She set her food down and leaned against the edge of the desk. "Anything new come to mind?" He shook his head. "I spent half the night looking up unusual dog breeds, hybrid species, even genetic anomalies. Nothing matches." Ellie took a sip of her coffee, then nodded toward the back. "It's awake, by the way. Eating a little. Seems more alert than yesterday." Mark stood. "Good. Let's do another round of checks." In the exam room, the creature sat in its kennel, watching them with those same golden eyes. It had perked up overnight, its head held higher, and its little tail wagged once when Ellie spoke softly to it. Mark crouched in front of the kennel, opening the door slowly. The small animal stepped forward, sniffing at his hand. It still didn't bark or make any typical puppy sounds, but its body language suggested it was growing more comfortable. Mark ran through the usual checks again. Temperature normal, heart rate steady. It had even gained a small amount of weight, likely thanks to the food Ellie had been coaxing it to eat. He glanced at its paws, those thick pads and sharp claws still striking him as odd. "Whatever it is," Ellie said, "it's starting to look healthier. That's good, right?" "It is," Mark said. "But I still don't understand what's going on. We'll keep monitoring and—" The sound of the front door chime cut him off. He and Ellie exchanged a glance before stepping out into the reception area. A woman stood by the counter, her coat dusted with the faint snow that had begun falling overnight. She looked nervous, clutching a small bag against her chest. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her glasses sat slightly askew. As Mark approached, she glanced at him, then quickly down at the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked. She hesitated before speaking. I heard you might have taken in an abandoned puppy yesterday." Mark tilted his head slightly. "We did, yes. Why?" The woman bit her lip, then said, Did anyone come looking for it?" Ellie, standing a step behind Mark, spoke up. "Someone did, actually. A man. Tall, blue eyes, dark hair." The woman's face paled. He was here? Mark's curiosity deepened. Yes, he said it didn't belong here. Do you know him? She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. I do, and he's right. It doesn't belong here. Mark felt a chill, and it wasn't from the weather outside. Why don't you come back to my office so we can talk? The woman hesitated, then nodded. Mark led her to the office, Ellie following behind. Once they were seated, Mark leaned forward. I'm Dr. Harrison, and this is Ellie. Who are you, and what's going on? The woman introduced herself as Nora. She explained that she was a wildlife biologist working with a small, privately funded research group that studied cryptic species, animals that were rarely seen, often mistaken for more common species, and largely unknown to science. According to her, the puppy wasn't a dog at all. It was a young specimen of a species that had only recently been discovered in a remote forest in the Pacific Northwest. They look like dogs at first, she said, her voice steady but tinged with worry. But their genetics are different. They're not entirely canine. We've been studying a small population of them in the wild. They're incredibly rare, and the fact that this one ended up here is alarming. Mark exchanged a glance with Ellie. Alarming how? Nora hesitated, then said, These animals are highly sensitive to environmental changes. Their survival depends on very specific conditions. If this one was removed from its habitat, it could be in serious danger, and so could the rest of its kind. Mark frowned. But why would someone abandon it here? Why not return it to the wild? Nora's expression darkened. I don't know. But if that man you described was here, it's possible he's involved. Our team has had run-ins with people trying to exploit these animals, selling them as exotic pets or using them in illegal breeding programs. If he knows about this one, it's not safe. Ellie leaned forward. But we haven't heard anything from him since last night, and the little one is doing better now. Is there a way to, I don't know, protect it? Keep it safe here? Nora shook her head. This clinic isn't secure enough. If he knows it's here, he'll come back. You need to relocate it to a secure facility, one where we can ensure it's cared for properly and kept out of the wrong hands. Mark sat back, absorbing the information. What kind of facility are you talking about? Nora explained that her organization maintained a sanctuary in a remote location, designed to house and study cryptic species. The sanctuary had the resources and expertise to care for the animal, as well as the security to keep it safe. But getting the creature there would be a challenge. They couldn't risk drawing attention to it, especially if the man from last night was watching. Mark felt torn. On one hand, he wanted to protect the little one. On the other, he wasn't sure he trusted Nora entirely. He needed more information. What proof do you have that you're with this organization? And how do I know the animal will be safe there? Nora reached into her bag and pulled out several documents, letters from the research group, photographs of the sanctuary, and even a video on her phone showing similar animals thriving in their natural habitat. Mark reviewed everything carefully, asking questions and listening closely to her answers. While he still had some reservations, the evidence was convincing. Finally, he said, All right, let's say we believe you. How do we get it to the sanctuary without alerting the wrong people? Nora's expression softened slightly, as if relieved. We have a plan. A secure transport vehicle is on its way. It's unmarked, and the driver is someone we trust completely. If we can keep the little one here until the transport arrives, we can get it out safely. Mark nodded slowly. How long until the transport gets here? Tomorrow morning, Nora said. In the meantime, we'll need to keep a low profile. No calls, no posting anything online, nothing that could tip off that man or anyone else who might be watching. Mark agreed, and they spent the rest of the day preparing. They reinforced the kennel, set up additional surveillance in the clinic, and made sure the creature was as comfortable as possible. Ellie stayed close by, speaking softly to the little one, while Mark and Nora discussed the logistics of the transport. It was clear that Nora genuinely cared about the animal's well-being, and Mark found himself starting to trust her. As night fell, the clinic was unusually quiet. The small animal slept soundly in its kennel, its breathing steady and calm. Mark watched it for a long moment, still marveling at how something so small and vulnerable could carry such a weight of mystery. He didn't know what the future held for this little one, but he was determined to see it safely through the night. Nora stayed at the clinic, setting up a makeshift workstation in Mark's office. She monitored a secure communication channel, checking in with her team and confirming the transport's progress. Ellie, meanwhile, brewed coffee and kept the mood light, chatting with Mark and Nora about everything from her favorite dog breeds to the latest veterinary techniques. The tension in the air eased slightly, replaced by a quiet camaraderie. By the time midnight rolled around, all three of them were tired but focused. They took turns checking on the little one, making sure it was comfortable and well-fed. Nora shared more about her work, describing the sanctuary and the other cryptic species they had encountered. Her passion was clear, and it helped Mark feel more confident in their plan. As the hours passed, the sense of urgency grew. Every sound outside seemed louder, every shadow more suspicious. Mark couldn't help but glance at the security cameras every few minutes, half expecting to see the man from the night before returning. But the night passed without incident. When morning finally came, a quiet relief settled over the clinic. The transport was just an hour away, and Nora was already preparing the documents and supplies needed for the journey. Mark and Ellie worked quickly, ensuring the little one was ready to go. It was a strange feeling. He had only known this tiny creature for a day, but he felt a deep connection to it. He wanted to make sure it would be safe. When the transport vehicle finally arrived, it was as Nora had described. Unmarked, discreet, and staffed by a single driver who greeted them with a professional but warm demeanor. Together, they loaded the kennel into the vehicle, securing it carefully. Nora turned to Mark. "Thank you for everything. We'll make sure it's safe." Mark nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness as he watched the vehicle drive away. He didn't know what the future held for the little one, but he hoped it would find a place where it could thrive, free from danger and mystery. As the vehicle disappeared down the road, Mark turned back to the clinic. The day's work was far from over, but for the first time since the little one had arrived, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had done the right thing. He glanced at Ellie, who offered a tired but genuine smile. "Ready to get back to work?" she asked. Mark returned the smile. "Let's do it." The quiet hum of the transport engine gradually faded into the distance, leaving Mark standing in the doorway of the clinic, his hands in his pockets. The events of the past 24 hours played in his mind, a whirlwind of confusion and cautious decisions. He glanced back at Ellie, who was already tidying up the reception area. There was no time to dwell. They had a full day of appointments ahead, a waiting room that would soon fill with people and pets, and the usual hustle that kept the clinic running. Mark moved to the back room to check on the supplies, a routine task that helped clear his head. But even as he sorted through boxes of bandages and syringes, he couldn't stop thinking about the tiny creature that had been in his care so briefly. What would become of it now? Would it thrive in the sanctuary? Or was it destined for something neither he nor Nora could predict? Ellie popped her head around the corner. "Hey, first patient's here. You good to start?" He nodded. "Yeah, let's get to it." As the day unfolded, Mark found himself slipping back into the familiar rhythm of his work. Each examination, each reassuring word to a nervous pet owner, helped push the lingering questions to the back of his mind. Yet, every now and then, a stray thought crept in. The golden eyes of the small creature, the odd pads of its paws, and the strange, inexplicable feeling he'd had when he held it. It was as if, for a brief moment, he'd been connected to something far beyond his usual realm of understanding. By the time the last appointment was finished, the clinic was quiet once again. Mark sat at his desk, the space dimly lit by a single desk lamp. Ellie had gone home, leaving him to lock up. The silence gave him too much room to think, and once more he found himself wondering about Nora's sanctuary. He hadn't heard from her since the transport left, and part of him wanted to reach out, to ask if everything had gone smoothly, but he resisted the urge. They had agreed on discretion, after all. The less attention drawn to the little one, the better. Instead, he turned his attention to the stack of files on his desk, trying to focus on the clinic's finances, pending orders, and upcoming staff schedules. But even as he flipped through the papers, his thoughts remained elsewhere. He felt like a piece of a puzzle had been dropped into his life, one he couldn't solve, but couldn't ignore. The following days at the clinic passed uneventfully. Patients came and went, and the routine settled back into place. Mark noticed that Ellie seemed more energized, as if the strange events had sparked something in her. She was quicker to offer a smile, more engaged with the clients, and even started pitching ideas for improving the clinic's outreach efforts. Mark appreciated her enthusiasm, though he couldn't help but think it was her way of channeling the same lingering curiosity he felt. It wasn't until the end of the week that he finally heard from Nora. A brief email arrived late one evening, just as he was finishing up some paperwork. The message was concise, but reassuring. The transport was successful. The little one is safe and adjusting well. Thank you again for your help. I'll keep you updated if there's any news. Mark sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with a persistent sense of unfinished business. He typed a quick reply. "Glad to hear it made it safely. Let me know if there's anything else I can do." After sending the message, he shut down his computer and turned off the office lights. It was late, and the clinic was dark except for the glow of the emergency exit sign. As he locked the front door and stepped outside, the cold night air hit him, sharp and crisp. He paused for a moment, looking up at the clear sky. The stars were bright, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of calm. The walk to his car was short, but in that brief stretch of silence, Mark felt a faint sense of closure. Whatever mysteries surrounded the little one, it was out of his hands now. His job had been to care for it, to ensure it was safe, and he had done that. The rest would be up to Nora and her team. Back at home, Mark made a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching as the wind stirred the trees outside. He thought about the strange journey that had begun with a simple cardboard box left on the clinic's doorstep. It wasn't often that something so extraordinary crossed his path. He didn't know if he'd ever encounter another mystery like it, but he knew that, for now, he could let it rest. Ellie stopped by his office the next morning, her expression brighter than usual. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks for letting me be a part of everything last week. It was weird, but kind of amazing." Mark smiled. "You did a great job. I couldn't have handled it without you." She grinned. "Well, If any more cryptic creatures show up, you know who to call." As she left the office, Mark chuckled softly. The clinic was returning to its normal routine, but he knew he'd never forget the golden-eyed creature that had temporarily turned his world upside down. The days stretched into weeks, and the memory of the mysterious animal faded into the background. Mark and Ellie continued their work, caring for the pets and families who relied on the clinic. Life settled back into its usual rhythm, but every so often, when Mark saw a certain play of light on a dog's fur or heard an unusual sound in the distance, he'd remember those golden eyes. And somewhere, far away, in a sanctuary nestled in the woods, a young, golden-eyed creature thrived in its new home, watched over by those who understood its importance. Though its path and Mark's had diverged, the brief moment they'd shared had left a quiet mark, a reminder of how the unexpected can change everything, even if only for a little while. As the weeks rolled by, the rhythms of the clinic settled back into place, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the strange little animal had left more than just a passing mystery behind. Ellie's energy hadn't waned either. Every now and then, she'd bring up ideas she had read online, new procedures, community outreach programs, even thoughts on improving their emergency response protocols. Though he didn't always have the time or resources to act on all her suggestions, he appreciated her enthusiasm. In a way, he thought, maybe that brief disruption to their routine had inspired them both to think bigger about their work. One crisp morning, the clinic was bustling. A mix of cats, dogs, and even a parrot filled the waiting room, their owners chatting softly among themselves. Mark was finishing up an exam on a Labrador with an injured paw when Ellie peeked her head into the room. "Hey, there's someone here asking for you specifically. Said he heard about you from a friend." Mark wiped his hands and stepped out into the reception area. A man in his early 30s stood near the counter. He had a clean-shaven face and a sharp, professional appearance. Gray slacks, a button-down shirt, and a lightweight jacket. Despite his polished look, there was something in his eyes that reminded Mark of the mysterious visitor from weeks before. This new man's gaze was steady, but he seemed to be holding back something. Worry. Curiosity. Maybe both. "Dr. Harrison?" the man asked as Mark approached. "That's me," Mark replied. "What can I do for you?" The man introduced himself as Jacob Trent. He explained that he worked with a private environmental organization focused on studying and preserving unique species in remote regions. When he mentioned the Pacific Northwest, Mark's interest was piqued. Jacob's demeanor was polite, even warm, but Mark felt an undercurrent of urgency. "I was told you might have some insight into a particular animal that surfaced in this area a few weeks back," Jacob said. "It's been of great interest to our researchers. I understand it might not be here anymore, but I was hoping you could share anything you learned about it." Mark glanced at Ellie, who stood a few feet away, listening intently. He decided to keep his response measured. "We did have an unusual case come through, but it was quickly transferred to a more suitable environment. I'm not sure how much I can tell you beyond that." Jacob nodded, seemingly unfazed by Mark's cautious tone. "I understand. Any information at all could be helpful. Its condition, behavior, anything you observed while it was here?" Mark hesitated, recalling the brief, strange time he had spent with the creature. He didn't want to betray any confidences, especially after Nora had gone to such lengths to ensure its safety. But something about Jacob's approach, his calm but pressing questions, made Mark think carefully. Could sharing a few details really put the animal at risk? Or might it help someone who truly wanted to understand it? "Well," Mark began, "it wasn't in great shape when it arrived. Undernourished, clearly frightened, But within a day, it started eating, gained some strength. It was different from anything I've seen before. Its eyes, the structure of its paws, even its behavior. It wasn't aggressive, but it also wasn't quite like a typical puppy. More reserved, as if it was constantly evaluating its surroundings. Jacob listened intently, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. When Mark paused, Jacob said, "That's consistent with what we've heard from other cases. Did it show any signs of unusual intelligence or problem-solving abilities?" Mark thought back. It seemed highly observant. It would watch us closely, like it was studying us, but it never tried to escape or resist. I wouldn't call it problem-solving, but it gave the impression of understanding more than a regular animal might. Jacob leaned forward slightly. "And when it left your care, did it seem stable? Healthy?" Mark nodded. "Yes, it seemed like it would recover just fine." Jacob straightened, his demeanor still professional, but now tinged with a hint of relief. "Thank you, Dr. Harrison. I can't overstate how valuable this information is. We're doing everything we can to ensure the survival of these creatures in the wild, and every detail helps." Mark studied him for a moment. "I hope that's true. They're rare and vulnerable, and it felt like we were only just starting to understand what we were dealing with." Jacob smiled faintly. "You have my word. We're working toward their protection. And if there's ever anything more you're willing to share, please don't hesitate to reach out." He handed Mark a business card. It was simple and understated. Just a name, phone number, and email address, with the organization's logo in the corner. Mark accepted it, though he wasn't sure he'd ever use it. As Jacob turned to leave, Mark felt a faint echo of the uncertainty he had felt the night the strange little animal had arrived. He had done his part, given it care, ensured its safety, passed it on to those who claimed to know what was best. But what happened next was beyond his control. The visitor's polite words and professional demeanor didn't fully ease the lingering questions in Mark's mind. That evening, after the clinic had closed and Ellie had gone home, Mark sat at his desk, holding Jacob's card. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the building's heater. He thought about the choices he had made, the trust he had placed in Nora's sanctuary, and now, perhaps, in this new visitor's organization. He wondered if he'd ever get the full story, where the little one had come from, how it had ended up in his care, and whether it would truly find a safe haven. With a sigh, he tucked the card into a drawer and leaned back in his chair. The workday was over, but the questions remained, floating just beneath the surface. For now, though, he could only wait and hope that his small role in the creature's story would lead to something better. Mark glanced down at the card again, turning it over between his fingers. Jacob Trent. He'd had plenty of unusual encounters in his career, but something about the man lingered in his mind. There was a polished quality to him, an ease that made him difficult to read. It wasn't just the card or the suit. Something deeper had set Mark on edge, though he couldn't say exactly what. The clinic was quiet now, the soft hum of the ventilation system the only sound. Mark leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He hadn't heard from Nora since that brief email saying the creature was safe, and part of him had hoped it would stay that way. No news meant the little one was adjusting, thriving even. But Jacob's sudden appearance changed that. Why now? Why him? Mark slid the card into his desk drawer, then locked it. He didn't need more questions tonight. The following days passed in their usual rhythm. Cats, dogs, and the occasional exotic pet filled the waiting room. Ellie kept the energy high, chatting with clients and slipping a treat to a nervous pup here and there. Mark found comfort in the routine. It was easy to bury himself in the everyday tasks, to focus on what he could control. But as the week wore on, the questions returned. Ellie, too, seemed more watchful, as if the whole experience with the strange creature had left her on edge. She still had her bright smile and quick wit, but there was a subtle change. A pause before she spoke. A glance toward the windows when she thought no one was looking. One afternoon, as Mark was reviewing a dog's x-rays, Ellie leaned against the doorway of the exam room. "Jacob guy ever get back to you?" she asked. Mark glanced up, surprised. "No? Why?" She shrugged, but there was a tension in her expression. "Just wondering if he found what he was looking for." "I told him everything I knew," Mark said. "Not much more I could offer." Ellie nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the floor. "It's just, that whole situation still feels off, you know?" Mark set down the x-ray film and gave her his full attention. "What are you thinking?" She hesitated, chewing her bottom lip. "That creature, whatever it was, it changed something around here. I can't explain it, but it's like we're still in the middle of a story that hasn't finished yet." Mark leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "Do you think it's coming back?" Ellie looked up sharply, her eyes wide. "No, not that. At least I don't think so. But it feels like it left something behind. Not physically, I mean, just, I don't know, a feeling." Mark frowned. He had sensed it too, though he hadn't been able to put it into words. It was as if the clinic itself had shifted, the usual patterns disrupted. He thought of Jacob's visit, of the strange calmness with which he had asked his questions. Maybe Ellie was right. Maybe they were still in the middle of a story they couldn't quite see. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "For now, we just keep doing our jobs. If anything else comes up, we'll deal with it." Ellie gave a small smile. "You're good at that, you know, staying grounded." "I try," Mark said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The days continued, filled with the usual hustle and bustle of clinic life. Yet the undercurrent of unease never quite faded. Mark noticed himself glancing at the clock more often, as if expecting a call or a visit. Ellie began double-checking the locks at the end of the day, even when Mark reassured her everything was secure. It was a subtle shift, but it hung in the air like an unanswered question. Then, late one evening, as Mark was finishing up some paperwork in his office, his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to answer. "Dr. Harrison," he said, his voice steady. "Dr. Harrison, it's Nora." Her voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath the surface. "I need to talk to you, in person." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "What's going on?" "I'll explain when I get there. Can I come by the clinic tonight?" He hesitated. "You sure it can't wait until tomorrow?" "No," she said firmly. "It's important." Mark glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. "All right, I'll be here." 15 minutes later, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel lot outside announced her arrival. Mark opened the door to find Nora standing there, her coat pulled tightly around her. Her face was pale, her expression serious. She stepped inside quickly, glancing around as if expecting someone to be following her. "What's going on?" Mark asked, closing the door behind her. Nora wasted no time. "I'm not sure who you've spoken to since the transfer, but you need to be careful. There are people looking for that creature. People who aren't with my organization." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" Jacob Trent was here asking questions, but he seemed legitimate. Nora shook her head. "Jacob's not who he says he is." The words hit Mark like a jolt. "What are you talking about? He had credentials. He knew about the creature, about your sanctuary." "He's a known name in our field," but he's not part of our group," Nora said. "We've had run-ins with him before. He's been linked to organizations that see these animals as commodities, not as something to protect. If he's been here, it means he's watching. It means others might be too." Mark felt his stomach tighten. "So what do we do? I don't have the creature anymore. It's at your sanctuary, right?" "Yes," Nora said. "But that doesn't mean it's safe. If they know it's there, they could try to take it." Mark rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it all. "What do you need from me?" "Information," she said. "Anything you can tell me about what Jacob asked, how he acted, anything that might help us figure out what he's planning. We need to stay ahead of him." Mark thought back to his conversation with Jacob. He described the questions, the calm demeanor, the way Jacob had thanked him and left without pressing too hard. Nora listened intently, nodding occasionally. "That matches what we know," she said finally. "He's subtle, but he's persistent. We'll have to keep a close eye on our facility, increase security. And, Dr. Harrison," she hesitated, then continued, "if he or anyone else comes back here, don't tell them anything. Even if they seem legitimate. Just call me." Mark nodded slowly. "All right, I'll do that." Nora stood, pulling her coat tighter. "Thank you. I know this isn't what you signed up for, but you've been a tremendous help. I'll keep you updated." As she left, Mark locked the door behind her, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together. But one thing was clear. The strange little creature had drawn more attention than anyone had anticipated. Mark knew he was just one small part of this larger story, but he also knew he couldn't walk away now. Too much was at stake. He turned off the lights and headed home, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was sure of one thing. The mystery was far from over. The next few days at the clinic passed in a blur of appointments and follow-ups, but beneath the surface, Mark remained on edge. Nora's warning hadn't just unsettled him, it had stuck with him, gnawing at his thoughts every time he had a quiet moment. He couldn't help but replay Jacob's visit over and over in his mind, searching for anything he might have missed. Every polite question, every subtle inflection, suddenly felt heavy with meaning he hadn't noticed at the time. Ellie, ever perceptive, picked up on his mood. "You've been quiet," she said one afternoon, as they cleaned up the exam room after a busy morning. "Just a lot on my mind," Mark replied, not looking up from the sink. She paused, a bottle of disinfectant in her hand. "It's about that guy, isn't it? The one who came asking about the creature." Mark sighed, shutting off the water. "Yeah, and what Nora told me after. It's hard not to think about it." Ellie frowned, her usual light-hearted demeanor replaced by concern. "Do you think he's going to come back?" "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But Nora said to be careful. If he shows up again, I'm supposed to call her right away." Ellie set down the bottle and leaned against the counter. "You really trust her?" He thought about it for a moment. "I trust that she wants to protect the creature. That much I'm sure of. Whether or not she has the full picture, I don't know. But she's the best lead we have." Ellie nodded slowly. "I just hope that if he does come back, we'll be ready." That evening, as Mark went through the clinic's monthly inventory, he found himself glancing at the front windows more than usual. The lights from the parking lot cast long shadows across the reception area, making every movement outside feel like a potential threat. He shook his head, frustrated with his own paranoia. But Nora's words had left an impression, one he couldn't shake no matter how much he tried to focus on the mundane tasks in front of him. He was just finishing up the last of the inventory checks when his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Mark hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. "Dr. Harrison," he answered. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a familiar voice. "Dr. Harrison, this is Jacob Trent. I hope I'm not calling too late." Mark's grip on the phone tightened. "Mr. Trent, what can I do for you?" Jacob's tone was calm, almost friendly. "I wanted to thank you again for your time the other day. The information you shared was very helpful, but I realized I may have forgotten to ask a few important questions. I was hoping we could meet again to discuss them." Mark hesitated. He remembered Nora's warning. If Jacob reached out again, he was supposed to contact her first. But Jacob's approach was so polite, so unassuming, that it was hard to imagine he posed any immediate danger. Still, Mark knew he couldn't be too careful. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy at the moment," Mark said, keeping his tone neutral. "Perhaps you could email me your questions instead?" There was a brief pause before Jacob replied. "I understand you're busy, but these aren't the sort of questions that can be answered through email. I'd prefer to speak in person, if possible." Mark felt a knot forming in his stomach. "I'll have to get back to you on that." "Of course," Jacob said smoothly. "Please let me know if you find the time. I'll be in town for a few more days." With that, the call ended. Mark set the phone down and ran a hand through his hair. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to talk to Nora. The following morning, Mark called Nora's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and direct. "Nora, it's Mark. I heard from Jacob Trent again." "What did he say?" she asked immediately. "He wanted to meet again. Said he had more questions. I told him I was busy, but he insisted it was important." There was a long pause before Nora replied. "Mark, you need to stay away from him. Whatever he's after, it's not good. If he reaches out again, don't engage. Just call me." "I understand," Mark said. "But what should I do in the meantime? If he shows up here?" "Keep your doors locked and don't let him in," Nora said firmly. "If he gets pushy, call the authorities and then call me. We'll handle it." Mark nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Got it." He ended the call, feeling a mix of relief and lingering tension. He trusted Nora's expertise, but he still felt like a pawn in a much larger game. For now, all he could do was follow her advice and hope that Jacob didn't push things further. As the week continued, Mark and Ellie kept the clinic running as usual, but the unease never quite left. Every time the front door opened, Mark found himself glancing up quickly, expecting to see Jacob's face. Each time it was just a client with their pet, he felt a brief surge of relief. Ellie, for her part, seemed to have taken on a watchful role. She was always near the front desk, her eyes flicking to the windows or the security cameras more often than before. She didn't say much about it, but Mark could tell she was just as concerned as he was. It wasn't until Friday afternoon that something unusual happened. Mark was finishing up a routine checkup on a senior cat when Ellie knocked on the exam room door. "Mark, can you come to the front for a second?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. He followed her out to the reception area. A man stood at the counter, his back to them, speaking quietly with the receptionist. He wore a dark coat and a hat that obscured his face. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about his posture, the way he carried himself, that seemed familiar. When the man turned around, Mark's breath caught. It wasn't Jacob, but there was a striking resemblance. The same sharp features, the same piercing gaze. This man was older, his hair graying at the temples, but the resemblance was uncanny. "Dr. Harrison," the man said, his voice calm and measured. "My name is Stephen Trent. I believe you spoke with my nephew Jacob recently." Mark exchanged a glance with Ellie, who looked just as surprised as he felt. "Yes, he was here not long ago. How can I help you?" Stephen offered a faint smile. I'm afraid my nephew can be overzealous at times. I wanted to personally apologize if he came across as intrusive. Our family has a keen interest in certain wildlife preservation efforts, and Jacob sometimes gets ahead of himself. Mark studied him carefully. I appreciate the apology, but I'm not sure what you're asking. Stephen raised a hand in a calming gesture. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to assure you that we're not here to cause trouble. Jacob's questions were out of curiosity, nothing more. I hope you'll forgive him if he seemed too forward. Mark nodded slowly, though he didn't feel entirely convinced. I understand. Thank you for letting me know. Stephen inclined his head. Of course, if you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. With that, he turned and left the clinic. Mark watched him go, the knot in his stomach tightening. Ellie came up beside him, her expression tense. Do you believe him? She asked quietly. Mark shook his head. I don't know, but something tells me this isn't the end of it. Mark sat at his desk long after Stephen Trent left, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the papers scattered in front of him. He wasn't reading them, though. His thoughts were entirely elsewhere. The resemblance between Stephen and Jacob was undeniable. But what troubled him more was the tone Stephen had used. Calm, measured, and somehow more unsettling than Jacob's politeness had been. It felt like a calculated move, a deliberate attempt to put Mark at ease. Ellie hovered in the doorway, watching him. You're not buying what he said, are you? Mark looked up at her. No, not really. Something about him seemed off. She stepped closer, crossing her arms. You think they're working together? Maybe, Mark said. Or maybe Stephen's just here to clean up after Jacob's mess. Either way, it doesn't feel like a coincidence. Ellie frowned. What do we do now? Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. We stay cautious. Keep an eye out for anything unusual. And if they come back, we follow Nora's advice. No answers, no information, just a phone call to her. Ellie nodded, but the worry in her eyes lingered. Okay. But Mark, if they're as connected as it seems, what's stopping them from just taking what they want? Mark didn't have a good answer for that. He'd been asking himself the same question. The thought of someone trying to force their way into the clinic was unsettling, but so far, everything had been words. Polite visits, subtle questions, and cryptic warnings. That didn't mean it would stay that way, though. The next few days were uneventful, but the tension didn't dissipate. Mark and Ellie kept the clinic running smoothly, but they both knew that something was simmering beneath the surface. Clients came and went, pets were treated, and the usual flow of work carried on. Yet every time the phone rang or the door opened, Mark felt a spike of adrenaline. He wasn't sure if it was paranoia or if he was genuinely waiting for the other shoe to drop. One afternoon, as the clinic was winding down, a package arrived. The courier dropped it off at the front desk, and Ellie signed for it. She brought it back to Mark's office, setting it on his desk with a questioning look. You expecting something? She asked. Mark shook his head. No, I didn't order anything. They both stared at the box for a moment. It was a standard shipping box, no markings other than the delivery label. The sender's name was unfamiliar, and there was no company listed, just an address in another state. Should we open it? Ellie asked. Mark hesitated, then nodded. Better to know what it is. Ellie handed him a box cutter, and he carefully sliced through the tape. Inside, he found a plain white envelope resting on top of a layer of packing material. He opened the envelope first, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was typed, short and to the point. Dr. Harrison, I believe you've come into contact with something extraordinary. This package contains information that might help you understand the significance of what you encountered. Please review it carefully and consider reaching out to discuss further. An interested party. Mark and Ellie exchanged a look. That's vague, Ellie said. Yeah, Mark agreed. He set the note aside and pulled back the packing material to reveal a thick folder. Inside were photocopies of documents, handwritten notes, and photographs. Mark flipped through them quickly, his heart sinking as he realized what he was looking at. It was a dossier on the creature. The documents included observations on its physical characteristics, behavioral patterns, and habitat. The photographs showed images of the forest, faint tracks in the mud, and what looked like a small, well-hidden burrow. The handwritten notes speculated about its origins, its role in the ecosystem, and its possible intelligence. Ellie leaned over his shoulder, her voice low. Where did this come from? Who sent it? Mark shook his head. I don't know. But whoever it is, they've been studying the creature for a while. He felt a chill as he realized that the person who sent this package might know more about the creature than even Nora did. And if they knew this much, what else did they know? Did they know it had passed through his clinic? Did they know where it was now? The last page of the dossier caught his attention. It was a map, marked with several locations. One of the marked spots was the clinic. Mark's stomach turned. Ellie, lock the doors, now. She nodded, her expression serious. I'll check the back, too. As Ellie hurried out of the office, Mark stared at the map. This wasn't just about the creature anymore. Someone was watching him, tracking the clinic's involvement. He thought about Nora's warning, about Jacob's visit, and Stephen's apology. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed wasn't one he wanted to see. When Ellie returned, she was holding her phone. I think you should call Nora. Mark nodded, picking up his own phone. He dialed Nora's number, and she answered quickly. Nora, it's Mark. We just got a package. He explained what they'd found. The dossier, the map, the cryptic note. Nora listened silently, then said, Mark, you need to leave the clinic. What? He asked, surprised. Just for the night, Nora said. Lock everything up and go somewhere safe. I don't know who sent that package, but if they have a map with the clinic marked, it's not safe to stay there right now. Mark glanced at Ellie, who was still standing in the doorway. All right, we'll close up and head out. Good, Nora said, and keep me updated if anything else happens. After ending the call, Mark and Ellie quickly secured the clinic. They locked every door, turned off the lights, and double-checked the security cameras. Then they left, driving separately to their respective homes. Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched even as he pulled into his driveway. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He kept replaying the events of the day in his mind. The package, the map, the warning. The questions swirled, each one leading to another. Who had sent the package? What did they want? And most importantly, how much danger were they really in? By the time morning came, Mark felt no more rested than he had the night before. He got up, made coffee, and stared out the window at his quiet neighborhood. The world outside seemed so normal, so unaffected by the strange events that had overtaken his life. But normal felt like a distant memory now. He checked his phone. There were no messages from Nora, no updates from Ellie. For a moment, he wondered if he should head back to the clinic just to check on things. But then he remembered Nora's advice. Stay away, at least for now. Instead, he decided to spend the morning going through the dossier again. He spread the pages out on his dining table, studying each one carefully. The notes were meticulous, filled with details about the creature's anatomy, behavior, and environment. The photographs were grainy but clear enough to show the distinctive features. The rounded ears, the golden eyes, the thick paw pads. It was all there, laid out in black and white. The map, however, troubled him the most. It wasn't just the clinic that was marked. There were other locations as well. A remote cabin in the woods, an isolated stretch of riverbank, and a small research station he didn't recognize. Mark couldn't make sense of it, but it was clear that whoever had compiled this dossier knew the creature's movements, and knew where it had been taken. He felt a surge of frustration. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a biologist or a conservationist. He was a veterinarian. All he wanted was to help animals in need, to run his clinic and care for his patients. This wasn't supposed to be his fight. But now, whether he liked it or not, he was involved. And he couldn't just ignore it. By the time afternoon rolled around, Mark's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Nora. "Can you meet me at the sanctuary tomorrow? We need to talk." Mark stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "I'll be there." As he hit send, he realized he didn't have a choice anymore. The mystery wasn't going to resolve itself. If he wanted answers, he had to keep going, step by step, even if it led him into territory he never thought he'd have to navigate. When Mark arrived at the sanctuary the next day, the sun was just cresting over the hills, casting a warm glow on the sprawling fields and dense woods that surrounded the facility. A gravel path led him to a modest building where Nora was waiting. She greeted him at the door, her expression serious but welcoming. "Thanks for coming," she said as she led him inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something herbal, and the walls were lined with photographs of various species, many of which Mark didn't recognize. A long table in the center of the room held stacks of papers, maps, and what appeared to be field equipment. Nora gestured for Mark to take a seat. "We've been going over the information you received in that package. It's troubling, to say the least." Mark sat down and folded his hands in front of him. "Do you know who sent it?" She shook her head. "Not yet. But whoever it is, they have extensive knowledge, more than we thought anyone outside our group could have. That map you showed me, it indicates they've been tracking not just the creature we brought here, but possibly others as well." Mark's stomach sank. "Others? Are you saying there's more than one?" Nora's eyes narrowed slightly as she considered her words. "We've always suspected there could be more, but this is the first solid evidence we've seen. The idea that multiple individuals have been sighted means this species might have a larger range than we thought. Or it could mean that the individuals who sent that package have been deliberately relocating them. Either way, it's not good news." Mark leaned forward, trying to absorb the implications. "If they're being moved around, wouldn't that explain why the one we found seemed so out of place? Maybe it wasn't abandoned. Maybe it was left there on purpose." Nora nodded slowly. "That's a strong possibility. And if that's true, then the people behind this are more organized and more dangerous than we realized." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He thought back to Jacob Trent and his uncle Stephen. Could they be involved? He decided not to mention them just yet, not until he was sure. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Nora opened a folder and spread out several documents on the table. "First, we need to confirm what's in this dossier. Some of these locations are familiar to us, but others aren't. I have a team heading out to check a few of the sites that were marked on the map. In the meantime, we need to make sure the sanctuary's security is solid. I've already increased patrols, but we may need to implement more measures." Mark frowned. What kind of measures? More cameras, motion detectors around the perimeter, and possibly hiring additional staff to monitor everything. We can't afford to take any chances. Mark nodded. It made sense, but he couldn't help feeling like they were always one step behind. The people who sent that package clearly knew a lot more than they did, and it was hard not to feel outmatched. Nora glanced at him, reading the concern on his face. Mark, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand something. We're not alone in this. There are others who care about protecting these creatures. We have allies, even if you don't see them. That's why we need to keep working together, sharing what we know and staying vigilant. He nodded again, though the weight of it all still pressed on him. I just wish I knew what they wanted. What's the end game here? Nora sighed. If I had to guess, it's about control. These creatures are unique, rare beyond belief. To the wrong people, that makes them valuable. Whether it's for profit, power, or something else, they see these animals as resources to exploit. But to us, they're something worth protecting. That's what this comes down to. Their survival versus those who would use them for their own gain. Mark looked down at his hands, thinking about the little creature he had cared for, the golden eyes that had seemed to look right through him. He didn't fully understand what it was, but he knew it didn't deserve to be a pawn in someone else's game. It deserved a chance to live, to thrive, to be something more than a curiosity or a commodity. After a long pause, he said, "All right. Tell me what you need from me." Nora smiled faintly, her expression softening for the first time since he arrived. "Right now, just stay alert. If you hear anything, see anything unusual, let me know immediately. We're putting together a network to keep track of any sightings, any movements. The more information we have, the better chance we have of staying ahead of them." Mark nodded, his resolve hardening. He might not have chosen this fight, but now that he was in it, he wasn't going to back down. He had a responsibility to the creature he had cared for, to whatever others might still be out there, and to himself, to do what he could. They spent the next hour going over the dossier in detail. Nora explained what her team was doing, the sites they were investigating, and the steps they were taking to secure the sanctuary. Mark offered what insights he could, though he still felt like he was playing catch-up. When they finally wrapped up, Nora walked him back to his car. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows across the gravel. As Mark opened the car door, she placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you, Mark. I know this isn't easy, but it means a lot to have someone like you on our side." He gave her a small smile. "We're in this together, right?" "Right," she said. "Stay safe." As Mark drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get more complicated. But he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. For now, he would focus on what he could control, keeping his eyes open, staying connected to Nora, and doing his best to protect the creatures that had found their way into his life, however briefly. Mark returned to the clinic the next day with a clearer sense of what he needed to do. Though the morning started out uneventfully, he carried the conversation with Nora in the back of his mind. Knowing that her team was actively investigating the locations from the dossier gave him a measure of relief, but he also felt the weight of needing to remain vigilant. The possibility that the people behind the package, and perhaps Jacob or Stephen, might reappear at any time kept him on edge. Ellie, ever attuned to his mood, brought him a fresh cup of coffee mid-morning. "You're not as tense as yesterday," she observed, setting the mug down on his desk. Mark offered a faint smile. "Just trying to stay ahead of things." She perched on the edge of his desk, her expression curious. "Have you heard from Nora again?" "Not since yesterday," Mark said, "but she's keeping me in the loop. Her team's following up on some leads." Ellie nodded, looking reassured. "Well, that's good. At least we know someone's on top of it." Mark appreciated her calmness. Even though the situation was far from resolved, Ellie's steady presence helped him keep his focus on the day-to-day tasks of running the clinic. Patients came and went, and the regular rhythm of the clinic provided a welcome distraction. Yet, whenever the reception bell jingled or the phone rang unexpectedly, Mark felt a jolt of anticipation, as if at any moment the next piece of the puzzle might drop into place. As the afternoon wore on, the clinic started to wind down. Ellie was in the back prepping supplies for the next day, and Mark was going over the appointment schedule when a shadow moved across the front window. He glanced up and saw a man standing just outside the door. His posture was relaxed, but his face wasn't visible from Mark's angle. The man didn't come in right away. He just stood there for a moment, as if debating whether to enter. Mark's pulse quickened. He put down the clipboard and stepped out from behind the counter, moving toward the door. Before he could open it, the man finally pushed it open and stepped inside. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, with a weathered face and sharp, assessing eyes. He wore a plain navy jacket and a ball cap, and his hands were shoved into his pockets. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, keeping his tone neutral. The man's gaze swept the room before settling on Mark. "I'm looking for Dr. Harrison," he said. His voice was steady, calm. "That's me," Mark replied. "What can I do for you?" The man stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "I'm Frank Simmons. I work with a private research organization." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "We're interested in unique biological specimens, animals that don't fit the usual patterns. I've heard through the grapevine that you might have come across something like that recently." Mark tensed, but kept his expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." Frank tilted his head slightly, studying him. "I mean a creature that's not quite a dog, not quite a wolf. Something different." Mark felt his stomach tighten. Whoever Frank Simmons was, he knew too much. "I'm sorry, Mr. Simmons," Mark said carefully. "I'm not at liberty to discuss any specific cases." Frank's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand. Confidentiality is important in your line of work, but I want you to know that my organization isn't interested in harming these creatures. We just want to study them, understand them, and ensure their preservation." Mark held his ground. "If that's the case, you should be talking to the proper authorities or conservation groups. I'm just a veterinarian." Frank nodded slowly, his expression still unreadable. "Of course. I just thought I'd reach out directly. Sometimes it's easier to get answers that way." He pulled a business card from his pocket and set it on the counter. "If you ever feel like talking, give me a call." Mark didn't pick up the card. "I'll keep that in mind." Frank's smile remained in place, but it was clear he wasn't getting what he wanted. With a slight nod, he turned and walked out the door. Mark watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited until Frank's figure disappeared down the street before exhaling slowly. Ellie emerged from the back, wiping her hands on a towel. "Who was that?" she asked. Mark glanced at the card on the counter but didn't pick it up. "Just someone asking questions. Nothing to worry about." Ellie's brow furrowed, but she didn't press further. "All right, I'm almost done with the inventory. Want me to lock up once I'm finished?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, thanks. I'll be in my office." He retreated to his desk, closing the door behind him. The conversation with Frank had left him shaken. It wasn't just that the man had known so much. It was the way he'd spoken, the calm confidence that suggested he wasn't going away anytime soon. Mark couldn't help but think of Nora's warning and her insistence on caution. If Frank Simmons was part of the same group that had sent the package, or even connected to Jacob or Stephen, it meant the network of people interested in these creatures was larger than he'd thought. He sat down and took out his phone, debating whether to call Nora. In the end, he decided against it, at least for now. He'd wait to see if Frank contacted him again before bringing it to her attention. For now, all he could do was stay alert and hope that the extra precautions Nora's team was taking would be enough. The rest of the evening passed quietly, but Mark couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. He left the clinic feeling more tense than he had in weeks, and when he finally got home, he found himself double-checking that all his doors and windows were locked. The sense of being watched, of being part of something much larger and more complicated than he'd ever anticipated, hung over him like a shadow. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he thought about the creature he had cared for, the tiny golden-eyed being that had set all of this in motion. He thought about the people who wanted it, the organizations that claimed to be working for its protection, and the ones that clearly had other motives. And he thought about his own role in all of this, how a chance encounter had drawn him into a web of secrecy and intrigue. In the stillness of the night, Mark resolved to keep doing what he could, no matter how uncertain things became. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew he couldn't turn away from it now. Too much was at stake, and even if he didn't fully understand the bigger picture, he felt a responsibility to see it through. For now, all he could do was take it one step at a time and hope that somehow he could make a difference. Mark left the clinic that evening with a heaviness that seemed to cling to him. The lights from the parking lot cast long shadows as he locked the doors behind him, and for a moment, he just stood there, staring at the quiet street. The weight of the past weeks settled over him like a thick fog. Every interaction, every warning, every visitor, each one had pulled him further into a mystery he never asked to be part of. By the time he got home, the house felt colder than usual. He turned on the lights, made himself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling up from the mug. The questions in his mind felt endless. He had tried to protect the creature, but what had he really accomplished? If anything, it seemed like his involvement had only drawn more attention to it, more danger. He thought about Nora, her resolve, her insistence that he trust her team. He thought about Ellie, her quiet courage in the face of everything they'd been through. He thought about the shadowy figures who seemed to circle around him, their motives unclear, but their presence always felt. And he thought about the creature itself, those golden eyes, the way it had watched him as if it understood more than it should. Mark set down his mug, rubbed his temples, and exhaled slowly. He was just one person, a veterinarian who had stumbled into something far beyond his world. But he couldn't turn back. The moment that creature had appeared on his doorstep, everything had changed. He reached for his phone and opened his email. There were no new messages from Nora, no updates from Ellie. The silence was both a relief and a source of anxiety. No news might mean the creature was safe, tucked away at the sanctuary. Or it might mean that the forces looking for it were closing in, planning their next move. Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know how much longer he could keep living like this, waiting for the next unexpected visitor, the next cryptic warning. He wanted to believe that the creature would be all right, that Nora's team would protect it, that all of this would eventually fade into memory. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning, Mark arrived at the clinic early, the air still cool and crisp. Ellie was already there, checking supplies and organizing the appointment schedule. She looked up as he walked in and offered a small smile. "Morning," she said. "Everything okay?" Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. "As okay as it can be." Ellie hesitated, then asked, "You think we'll hear from them again?" Mark didn't have an answer. He shrugged and said, "I don't know, but if we do, we'll handle it. We've gotten this far." She seemed to take some comfort in his words, even if he wasn't sure he believed them himself. Together, they got to work, seeing patients and focusing on the tasks at hand. The routine helped, giving them both something tangible to hold on to, but the undercurrent of unease remained, a quiet reminder that their world had been altered in ways they couldn't fully understand. The day passed without incident, and as the afternoon wore on, Mark found himself thinking less about the creature and more about the future. He had learned to navigate these unexpected challenges, to keep going even when the path was unclear. He wasn't sure what the next chapter would hold, but he knew that he wasn't alone in facing it. Ellie locked up the clinic that evening, and as Mark watched her double-check the doors and security cameras, he felt a flicker of hope. They had come through a storm together, and while the skies were still cloudy, there was a sense that they could weather whatever came next. Mark turned off the lights, locked his office, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the street quiet. He looked up at the night sky, the stars scattered like tiny beacons of light. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of calm. He didn't have all the answers, and he probably never would, but he had done what he could, and he knew that mattered. As he drove home, the clinic fading into the distance, Mark allowed himself to exhale. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. The creature, wherever it was, had changed everything. But it had also reminded him of why he became a veterinarian, to care, to protect, to make a difference. And for that, he was grateful.